The security guard would not look at me. That was the part one remembered most afterward, not my mother's voice, not the sliding glass doors, not the smell of hand sanitizer and floor wax that every hospital seems to share like a secret. It was the guard's eyes sliding sideways, refusing to meet mine, because he already knew what he was about to do, and he didn't want to be the one doing it. "Ma'am, I need you to step back from the desk." "I'm his daughter," I said. I said it the way you say your own name, the way you don't expect to have to prove. "Richard Hale. Room 412. I got a call an hour ago that he coded. I need to see him." Behind the guard, at the nurse's station, my mother stood with her arms crossed over a cardigan I had bought her for Christmases ago, back when we still exchanged gifts, back when I still believed the four of us were a family instead of three people, and a fourth one they tolerated. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She looked at the charge nurse, then at me, then said the sentence that would end up on 100,000 screens before the year was over, though none of us knew that yet. "She's not our daughter. Don't let her back there." "I want to tell you," I said something devastating in that moment. I didn't. I said, "What?" Just that, just the small, stupid word people say when the floor changes shape under them. The nurse looked between us, uncertain, and made the only choice hospitals ever make when a family disagrees in the hallway. She chose caution. She chose my mother. I did not get to see my father that night. I did not get to see him the next day, or on the Tuesday 6 weeks later when he died with my mother and my sister in the room, and me in a parking lot, unable to see the window. What none of them knew, what even I had half forgotten, tucked away in a drawer of my own life I hadn't opened in years, was that my father had spent the last 4 years of his life quietly making sure that the last word in this story would not be my mother's. It would be his. It was sitting in a lawyer's office, in a manila folder with my name misspelled on the tab in his handwriting, waiting for a Tuesday 6 weeks later that none of us saw coming. This is that story. I should tell you who I was before any of this happened, because the version of me my mother described to that nurse, the stranger, the imposter, the woman with no claim on the men dying 40 feet away, was not built in a single moment. It was built over 26 years, one small omission at a time, until omission became architecture and architecture became a wall nobody had to mention out loud. I am the middle child. There were 3 of us, my older sister Denise, born 18 months before me and treated, from what I can tell, like the prototype that worked, me, the one who came out a little quieter, a little more watchful, the one who learned early that the fastest way to avoid trouble in that house was to need less of everything, less attention, less money, less forgiveness, and my younger brother Tyler, born 5 years after me, arriving into a household that had, by then, decided who its favorites were and simply expanded the seating chart to include him without renegotiating anyone's place at the table. My father, Richard, ran a small chain of hardware stores across 3 counties, nothing glamorous, just steady, the kind of business that pays for braces and a modest lake cabin and not much else, but it was his, built from one location his own father had left him with more debt than inventory. He worked 6 days a week for most of my childhood. My mother, Linda, ran the house, ran the finances, and ran, though I didn't have the language for it as a kid, the emotional temperature of every room she walked into. If she was warm, the house was warm. If she was cold, we all found reasons to be somewhere else. She was not cold to Denise. Denise got the school clothes bought a size up so she'd grow into them nice, got driven to dance and later to pageant coaching 2 towns over, got the family car at 17 with a bow on it in the driveway, photographed for the church newsletter. She was not cold to Tyler, either, not once he arrived, the long-awaited son, the one who'd carry the Hale name forward, doted on in a way that would have been sweet to watch if I hadn't spent 5 years learning to read a room before he ever set foot in one. She was cold to me. Not cruel, not in any way you could point to and photograph. Just cool. Distant in the specific way that makes a child assume the fault must be theirs, because surely a mother doesn't simply decide, early and without much discussion, that one of her children is going to be the logistical one, the low-maintenance one, the one who doesn't need as much because she never complains about needing less. My father tried, in his own limited way, to balance it. He was not a demonstrative man, I don't remember him saying, "I love you," more than a handful of times in 20 years, but he showed up in smaller currencies. He'd take me to the store on Saturdays and let me run the register, let me count out the till at closing, taught me to read a balance sheet before I could drive. He remembered which glass I liked at restaurants. He kept a photo of me graduating community college on the shelf behind his desk at store number 1, the original location, the one with his father's name still faintly visible under the newer sign, if you knew where to look. I left home at 19, not dramatically, not with a fight, just a slow drift that both my mother and I seemed to privately agree was for the best. I built a life 2 hours away, a job in logistics management that turned into a decent career, a small house I was proud of, a handful of close friends who knew more about my actual daily life than my own mother did. I came home for holidays. I called my father on Sundays, usually while my mother was at choir practice, because our conversations were easier without an audience. Denise married well and stayed local, folded seamlessly into the family business's social orbit, hosting the holiday parties, running the store's Facebook page, positioned, without anyone ever quite saying it, as the heir apparent. Tyler struggled through 2 false starts at college before settling into a vague role at the flagship store that mostly involved being present and being forgiven for being late. I sent birthday cards. I showed up when it mattered. I was, by any fair accounting, a present, functional, loving daughter who happened to live somewhere else and happened to require less maintenance than her siblings. None of that, apparently, was the same as being counted. I think, looking back, the clearest evidence of the pattern wasn't in any single dramatic moment. It was in the small administrative details of a family, the kind you only notice in aggregate. When Denise got married, my mother spent 11 months planning the shower, the engagement party, the rehearsal dinner seating chart, color-coded on a whiteboard in the kitchen for the better part of a year. When I got engaged, briefly, at 24, to a man I ultimately didn't marry, my mother asked exactly one question: "Have you set a date yet?" In the same tone she might have asked about a dentist appointment, and never asked again. I used to tell myself it was because she assumed I had it handled. It took me a long time to consider the simpler explanation, that she didn't especially want to spend 11 months on it. There was a school project in the 7th grade, a family tree assignment, where I remember sitting at the kitchen table asking her questions about her side of the family, her grandmother's maiden name, the town in Ohio her father had grown up in, and watching her answer Denise's identical questions, asked 20 minutes later, with noticeably more detail and noticeably more patience. I didn't understand it as a pattern at 12. I understood it, the way children do, as evidence about myself rather than evidence about her. I decided, somewhere around that age, that I must simply be a less interesting person to talk to, and I built the next 15 years of my personality quietly around not asking for more attention than I apparently deserved. My father, for his part, never confronted her about any of it directly, as far as I ever saw. What he did instead was smaller, steadier, almost covert, the register lessons on Saturdays, yes, but also the way he'd call me first with big news, before he called Denise or Tyler, then ask me, gently, not to mention it yet, as if he needed a private audience before the family one. He drove 2 hours, alone, to see my first apartment when I moved out, and stayed for 3 hours making small talk about nothing in particular, and I understood only years later that the visit itself was the point, that he'd wanted, quietly, to be a father who showed up somewhere my mother hadn't thought worth the drive. I've spent a lot of the last 8 months turning over whether he knew, back then, exactly what kind of imbalance he was living inside of, or whether he told himself, the way people do, that it wasn't as bad as it looked, that both his wife and his middle daughter loved him, and that was enough, that he didn't need to choose a side of a war he didn't want to admit was happening in his own kitchen. I don't think he was a coward, exactly. I think he was a man who'd learned, the way a lot of men of his generation learned, that keeping a marriage functional mattered more than keeping it honest, and that the bill for that trade doesn't come due until much later, usually to someone who never agreed to pay it. I want to be fair here, because it would be easy to tell this story as a clean line from villain to victim, and real families are rarely that clean. I was not always generous in return. There were years I let the distance between my mother and me calcify instead of trying to close it. Birthdays I sent a card instead of a call because the call felt like more than I had to give that week. I judged Denise for things that, if I'm honest, were as much my mother's doing as hers. I wasn't a saint standing quietly in the corner of this story. I was a person, doing the best imperfect job I could with a family that had already decided, long before I had any say in it, roughly how much of me it wanted. My father's heart had been a slow-burning problem for a decade, 2 stents, a diet he treated as a suggestion, a cardiologist who'd stopped bothering to disguise his exasperation. So when my mother called on a Thursday evening in March and said, in the same voice she'd have used to report a scheduling conflict, "Your father's had some kind of episode, they've taken him to St. Augustine's," I didn't panic. I'd heard some version of this sentence before. I told her I'd drive down that weekend. By Friday morning, the voice on the phone was Denise's, and it was different. "It's bad," she said. "They're saying his heart's not going to hold. You should come now, not this weekend." I left within the hour. 2 hours of highway, my hands too tight on the wheel, calling the hospital's main line twice for updates the front desk wouldn't give a non-immediate family member over the phone, a detail that meant nothing to me at the time, and would mean a great deal later. I told myself he'd stabilized before. He'd stabilize again. I told myself this the way you tell yourself things you need to be true rather than things you know to be. I got to St. Augustine's a little after 4 in the afternoon. The lobby was that particular fluorescent quiet hospitals specialize in, where you can hear the elevator doors 60 feet away with total clarity because nobody's talking. I gave my name at the front desk, said I was there for Richard Hale, said I was his daughter. The woman at the desk, not unkind, just following a system, told me to have a seat, that someone would come get me. Nobody came to get me. 40 minutes passed. I went back to the desk and asked again, more firmly this time, and that was when she made a call, spoke quietly, hung up, and told me that per the family's instructions, visitor access to Mr. Hale's room was currently restricted to a specific list, and my name wasn't on it. I remember laughing, an ugly, startled sound, not real laughter at all, because it seemed so obviously like a clerical error. "I'm his daughter," I said again. "The way you repeat a fact you assume is self-evidently going to fix things. There's been a mistake. Can you call up and check?" She called up. That was the call that brought my mother down to the lobby instead of a nurse, cardigan and all, moving with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had already decided how this conversation would go before she got in the elevator. She did not hug me. She did not ask how the drive was. She stood at a distance of maybe 6 feet, the exact distance you'd keep from someone you didn't fully trust, and she said, "You shouldn't have come. He's dying, Mom." Of course I came. "He's my husband," she said, as if I'd claimed otherwise. "This is a family matter, and it's already stressful enough without you making it about you." I didn't understand in that moment that I was not being scolded. I was being informed of a decision that had already been finalized. It wasn't until the second confrontation, 20 minutes later, up at the 4th floor nurse's station where I'd gone around her by taking the stairs, that the decision was said out loud, in front of witnesses, in the sentence that would define the next 6 weeks of my life and eventually, a great deal more than that. "She's not our daughter. Don't let her back there." The charge nurse, a woman maybe 10 years older than me with a lanyard full of pins from what looked like decades of service, glanced between us with an expression I recognized even through my own shock, the specific discomfort of someone who has clearly seen family disputes play out at this desk before and has no institutional tool for adjudicating which side is telling the truth. "Ma'am," she said to my mother, carefully, "is there something we should have on file about visitor restrictions?" "There will be," my mother said, "if this continues." She said it evenly, without raising her voice even slightly, and that evenness was, I would come to learn, the most effective weapon she had. A shouting woman gets escorted out by security and written up as unstable. A calm woman, speaking in complete, reasonable sentences, gets believed by default, because our instinct is to assume that whoever sounds most in control of themselves must also be the one telling the truth. I asked to speak to a supervisor, to my father's physician, on the theory that a doctor would have no stake in whatever this was. The charge nurse said the attending was with a patient, and that out of caution, until the family situation was clarified, I'd need to remain in the waiting area. I remember the phrase precisely, the family situation, as if I were a logistical variable rather than a person standing 8 feet from her father's room. I sat in that waiting area for 6 hours. I watched Denise arrive around 8, hug our mother, disappear down the hallway toward room for 12 without a glance in my direction, though I know she saw me, the only person sitting alone in a row of blue vinyl chairs at 8 o'clock on a Friday night. I texted my father twice, though I had no way of knowing if he could even read a phone, just short things: I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I love you, because it felt better than doing nothing. Around midnight, a different nurse, younger, off the record and clearly a little uncomfortable about it, crouched down next to my chair and told me quietly that my father had stabilized somewhat overnight, that he wasn't in immediate danger the way the earlier call had suggested, and that she was sorry, but she really couldn't say anything more than that without risking her job. It was the only kindness I received in that building for 6 weeks, and I've thought about that nurse more than once since, wishing I'd gotten her name, wishing I'd had some way to thank her afterward for the 10 seconds of humanity she offered a total stranger sitting alone in a hallway at midnight. I left around 1 in the morning, not because I wanted to, but because a security guard, not the same one from the front desk, told me, not unkindly, that visiting hours had technically ended 4 hours earlier and my continued presence, given the situation, was something he'd been asked to note. I understood the note for what it was. I drove 2 hours home in the dark with the radio off, replaying the sentence from the nurse's station on a loop I couldn't turn off, trying to locate a version of the last 31 years that made it make sense, and not finding one. The next 6 weeks were not a single dramatic battle. They were a slow, grinding accumulation of small refusals, each one individually deniable, each one collectively unmistakable. I called the hospital's patient advocate the morning after that first night in the parking lot. She was sympathetic, professionally so, and explained gently that when family members disagree about visitation, and no advance directive names specific visitors, hospitals generally defer to whichever family member holds medical decision-making authority or, absent that, to the spouse. My mother, married to my father for 31 years, was the default authority. Unless I could produce documentation proving otherwise, there was nothing the hospital could, or more accurately, would, do. I didn't have documentation. As far as I knew, none existed. My father had never mentioned a power of attorney, a healthcare directive, anything. Why would he have? None of us expected to need one for years yet. I called Denise, hoping, foolishly, in hindsight, that she'd be an ally. She wasn't unkind about it, but she wasn't helpful either. "Mom's really stressed," she said. "I think it's better if you just let her handle this her way for now. You know how she gets." I asked what that meant exactly, being handled. Denise didn't have an answer for that, or didn't want to give me one. I called Tyler. He didn't pick up for 3 days, and when he did, his message was shorter: "Mom says you're causing drama." Dad doesn't need drama right now. I wanted to ask him how, precisely, standing in a parking lot asking to see my own father constituted drama, but by then I understood that the question wasn't going to land the way I meant it. In that house, drama had always meant anything that made my mother uncomfortable, regardless of who caused the discomfort or why. My Aunt Carol, my mother's own sister, someone I'd always liked, called me on day 9, not to offer support but to relay a message, gently, the way you'd deliver bad news you didn't personally agree with but weren't willing to fight. "Your mom just thinks it's easier if things stay calm right now. She's asked the family to kind of give her space to manage this. I think she just needs you to respect that, honey." I want to be precise about what the family recruiting other relatives looked like, because it rarely looked like conspiracy. It looked like a dozen individually reasonable-sounding phone calls, each one asking me to be the bigger person, to not make a scene, to think about how stressed my mother was, to consider that maybe now wasn't the time to push. Nobody said the sentence from the hospital lobby out loud again. Nobody had to. It sat underneath every one of those calls like a foundation nobody wanted to look at directly. I tried 3 more times to see him in person. Once, I brought a letter for the nurses to pass along, in case they wouldn't let me in, 3 paragraphs I'd rewritten a dozen times, telling him I loved him, that I was outside, that none of this was because I'd stopped trying. I never learned whether it reached him. Once, I waited in the cafeteria for 4 hours on a day I knew my mother had a doctor's appointment of her own, hoping for a window. Denise intercepted me before I made it to the elevator, not aggressively, just immovably, the way you'd block a door with your body without ever raising a hand. Once, I simply asked the attending physician directly, doctor to stranger, whether there was any clinical reason I couldn't see my own father. He was kind but careful. Family dynamics aren't really something I can adjudicate, he said. I can tell you his prognosis is poor. I'd encourage you to resolve whatever this is quickly. I didn't know how to resolve something I didn't understand the shape of. I hadn't done anything. There was no incident, no falling out, no fight I could point to as the reason. As far as I could tell, my mother had simply decided, in the crisis of losing her husband, that this was the moment to finalize a hierarchy she'd been building quietly for 30 years, and my father's dying was, to her, an opportunity to control the narrative of our family one last time while there was no one left with the standing to contradict her. Somewhere around week 2, the calls from relatives took on a more organized quality, and I began to suspect, correctly, I'd learn much later from my Aunt Carol herself, who eventually felt guilty enough to admit it, that my mother had made a specific list of who to call, and in what order, a kind of soft campaign, calibrated to wear down my resolve one relationship at a time rather than confront me directly. My cousin Michelle called to say she'd heard I was making things hard on everyone. My father's own younger brother, Uncle Paul, a man I'd always considered fair-minded, called to suggest that maybe the respectful thing to do, given how stressed my mother clearly was, would be to take a step back for now and let the dust settle, as though there were dust to settle, as though this were a disagreement over a seating chart rather than a woman telling medical staff I didn't exist. I want to describe what that campaign did to me internally, because I think it's the part people underestimate about this kind of exclusion. It wasn't just that I couldn't see my father. It was that every single person I might have turned to for support had already, independently, absorbed a version of events in which I was the unreasonable one, the daughter causing drama during a family tragedy, and I found myself exhausted and grieving and increasingly isolated, starting to wonder if they were right. That's the specific cruelty of a well-run pressure campaign. It doesn't just block you from a room. It makes you doubt your own reading of the room you're being blocked from. Meanwhile, the small physical details kept surfacing, the way details do when you're paying obsessive attention to a situation you can't control any other way. Denise posted a photo on social media, 17 days in, of herself sitting bedside with my father, holding his hand, captioned with a heart emoji and the words, "So grateful for every moment." I stared at that photo for a long time. I wasn't angry at her for being there, of course she should have been there. I was angry at the specific arithmetic of it, the fact that gratitude for every moment was apparently a privilege being rationed by my mother according to rules only she understood. On day 22, I drove down again, uninvited, and instead of going to the hospital, I went to my parents' house, reasoning that my mother couldn't very well have hospital security follow her home. She wasn't there at the hospital, as it turned out, but Tyler was, home between shifts at the store, and for about 10 minutes, alone with him in the kitchen where I'd grown up, I got the closest thing to an honest conversation the whole ordeal produced. He looked tired, younger than his actual age, caught visibly between two people he didn't want to disappoint. "I don't really get what's going on either," he admitted, quietly, glancing toward the hallway as if our mother might materialize from it. "She just keeps saying it's complicated and that you'll understand eventually." I don't think I believe her, but I also don't know what to do about it. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even really support. But it was the first crack of doubt I'd heard from inside the family itself, and I held onto it for days afterward like a small, stolen coin. I tried, around week 4, going over my mother's head in a different way, contacting the hospital's ethics committee directly, a resource I only learned existed because the patient advocate mentioned it almost as an afterthought. The committee reviewed my complaint and responded, 10 days later, with a carefully worded letter explaining that absent legal documentation establishing my standing, and given that my father's wife retained default authority as spouse, they had no grounds to intervene in what they characterized as a family visitation dispute rather than a matter of patient rights violation. I read that letter in my car in a grocery store parking lot and sat there for 40 minutes afterward, unable to make myself go inside and buy the groceries I'd driven there for. Somewhere in that same stretch of weeks, my mother began, without ever saying so directly, to rewrite the timeline of our relationship for the benefit of anyone who'd listen. I heard, secondhand, through my Aunt Carol, that she'd started telling people at church that I'd always been the difficult one, that I'd never really made peace with not being the favorite, language that struck me as almost admirably efficient, a single sentence that managed to acknowledge the favoritism I'd spent 30 years being told I was imagining, while simultaneously using its existence as evidence against my character rather than hers. I wanted, more than once, to call every person who'd heard that version and correct the record. I didn't. Partly out of exhaustion, and partly because some instinct told me that arguing with a narrative always sounds like proof of exactly the instability the narrative accuses you of. I started keeping a log during those weeks, almost by accident at first, a note on my phone where I'd jot down dates, who'd called, what they'd said, not because I had any plan for the information but because writing it down was the only way I could make the fog of those 6 weeks hold still long enough to examine. Reading back over that log later, after everything, I was struck by how consistent the pattern was, never a single dramatic confrontation, just a steady, almost bureaucratic drip of small refusals and reframed history, each one small enough to seem forgivable in isolation, all of them together adding up to something that felt, by week 5, less like grief and more like erasure. The lowest of those individual moments came on day 31, a Sunday, when I drove down uninvited a third time and found, parked in the hospital's small chapel just off the main lobby, my mother sitting alone. I almost didn't go in. But something made me sit down 2 pews behind her, quietly, not saying anything, just present in the same room for the first time in a month. She knew I was there, I watched her shoulders register it, and she didn't turn around, and she didn't ask me to leave. We sat like that for almost 20 minutes, in total silence, 2 women who used to be a mother and a daughter, now just 2 people occupying the same small room because neither of us could think of anything true enough to say out loud. When she finally stood to leave, she paused beside my pew just long enough to say, without looking at me, "This isn't personal," before walking out, and I remember thinking, watching her go, that of all the things she'd said to me in a month, that one might have been the cruelest precisely because I think she believed it. It was during those 6 weeks, in the strange insomniac hours of 2 and 3 in the morning, that I started remembering things I hadn't thought about in years. A Tuesday 4 years earlier when my father had asked me, almost offhand, to come with him to an appointment downtown, I'd assumed it was medical, hadn't asked, driven him, waited in a lobby that turned out to belong to a law office, not a clinic, and he'd come out 40 minutes later saying only, "Just some paperwork, don't worry about it," in the tone he used when he genuinely didn't want to be asked twice. A locked drawer in his study I'd noticed once as a teenager and never thought to question, because children don't question the furniture of their parents' lives. A single sentence he'd said to me on the phone, maybe 18 months before any of this, apropos of nothing, that I'd filed away as one of his odd, sideways attempts at affection. "You've always been the one who actually listens to me. I want you to know that's not nothing to me." At the time, I'd thought it was just Dad being Dad, quietly sentimental in the way he never was to your face. I didn't understand until much later that he'd been telling me something. That he had, in fact, already decided something, and had already done something about it, for years before anyone would need to know. I didn't put those pieces together yet. Not fully. What I did in the 5th week, out of desperation more than strategy, was call a lawyer, not because I expected to find anything, but because I no longer knew what else to do with my hands. Her name was Priya Anand, a family law attorney a colleague had recommended, and in our first phone call I laid out the situation mostly as a complaint, not a case. "I don't have any legal standing here, do I?" I asked her, more statement than question. "Has your father ever executed a healthcare power of attorney?" she asked. "Or will you're aware of?" "I don't know," I said. "Nobody's ever told me anything like that exists." "That's worth checking," she said. "Sometimes people put things in place quietly, specifically so a spouse or other relative can't interfere with them later. It happens more than you'd think, especially in families with this kind of dynamic. I'd start by contacting any attorney your father's ever used for the business. Sometimes personal and business paperwork end up with the same firm." I hadn't thought of that. My father's business attorney was a man named Warren Ostrander, semi-retired now, who'd handled the hardware chain's contracts for as long as I could remember. I called his office the next morning, more out of following instructions than any real hope. His paralegal took my name, put me on hold for what felt like a very long time, and came back with a sentence that changed the temperature of the entire 6 weeks that had come before it. Mr. Ostrander says he's actually been expecting a call from you. He'd like to schedule an appointment. I didn't get that appointment in time. My father died on a Tuesday, 4 days after that phone call, before Warren Ostrander's calendar had an opening, before I understood what expecting a call from you even meant. Denise texted me at 6:47 in the morning. Dad passed a little after 5. Mom was with him. It was peaceful. 3 sentences, sent the way you'd confirm a delivery. No call. No, I'm sorry you weren't here. Just the fact of it, delivered flat, as if the 6 weeks before it hadn't happened, as if I hadn't spent 39 days trying to get into a room 40 feet away from where my father took his last breath surrounded by people who had made sure I wasn't one of them. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time that morning, not crying, not yet, just still, in the particular stillness of a body that hasn't caught up to news yet. I thought about the last real conversation I'd had with him, 4 months earlier, before any of this started, before he was even sick in the way that mattered. We'd talked about nothing important. The weather. A shipment delay at store number 3. Whether I was still seeing the man I'd mentioned a few times, whom he'd never met and now never would. I hadn't known it was the last conversation. You never do. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with being excluded from someone's death, and I want to name it plainly, because I think people who haven't lived it assume grief is grief, one shape, one size. It isn't. Ordinary grief, terrible as it is, at least lets you finish something, a goodbye, a hand held, a last look. What I was left with instead was grief with a locked door on the end of it. I didn't get to say goodbye. I didn't get to ask him what that lawyer's office had been for 4 years earlier, in the last months, when his voice could have still answered me directly instead of through paper. The funeral, 5 days later, was its own quiet cruelty. I went. Nobody stopped me at a funeral that would have looked bad, and my mother was always careful about how things looked, but I was seated in the 3rd row, behind Denise's in-laws, while my mother, in the front pew, accepted condolences from a receiving line that never once turned to include me. I stood at the reception afterward holding a paper cup of coffee I didn't drink, watching people I'd known my whole life approach my mother with soft voices and careful hands, and approach me, when they approached me at all, with the slightly confused, slightly pitying expression of people who'd heard some version of a story and weren't quite sure which version was true. This was, if I'm honest, the actual bottom of it, not the hospital lobby, not the parking lot, not even the flat text message at 6:47 in the morning. It was standing at my own father's funeral, in the very back half of the room, and understanding with total clarity that my mother intended for this to be the final shape of things. That she believed, correctly as far as she could tell, that she had won. That whatever paperwork existed in Warren Ostrander's office, whatever my father had quietly built in that 4-year-old appointment I'd once driven him to without asking questions, would either turn out to be nothing, or would arrive too late to matter, or would somehow, in the way my mother had always managed to reshape reality around herself, simply not be enough. I made a decision at that reception, standing near a folding table of cold catered sandwiches nobody was eating. I decided I would not fight her in the room. I would not make a scene, would not demand answers from relatives who'd already made their choice, would not spend one more ounce of the little dignity I had left trying to convince people who'd already decided not to be convinced. I would simply call Warren Ostrander back, first thing the next morning, and find out exactly what my father had done. I would let the paperwork speak, because he had apparently spent 4 years making sure it would. The will reading was scheduled for a Thursday, 3 weeks after the funeral, in a conference room on the 2nd floor of Ostrander, and chin that smelled faintly of the same lemon-oil furniture polish my father's own store had always used on the display cases. I arrived early. My mother arrived on time, with Denise beside her and Tyler trailing a step behind, all 3 of them dressed like they were attending something ceremonial rather than administrative, which, I would come to understand, my mother genuinely believed it to be, a formality, a confirmation of an order she already assumed was settled. Warren Ostrander was a small, precise man in his late 60s who shook my hand for a beat longer than strictly necessary and said, quietly, just to me, "I'm glad you're here. I've been trying to reach you for 6 weeks." I didn't have time to ask what that meant before my mother's voice cut across the room, brisk and slightly impatient, asking whether we could get started, as she had a hair appointment at 2. Warren opened a folder, not the manila one from my memory, a newer one, though I'd learn later the original was clipped inside it, and began the way these things apparently begin, with formalities about the reading of the last will and testament of Richard Allen Hale. My mother sat with the particular composure of someone expecting good news. I watched her hands, folded in her lap, perfectly still. The first several minutes were unremarkable, the house going jointly to my mother as expected, personal effects distributed among the three of us in ways that felt, if anything, deliberately even-handed, small specific bequests to Denise and Tyler that read like exactly what you'd expect a father to leave his other 2 children. My mother's shoulders had begun to relax by the 4th paragraph. This was going, from her perspective, precisely according to plan. Then Warren turned a page, and his voice changed register slightly, not dramatically, just the shift of a man reading something he knew was going to land differently than everything before it. To my daughter he read, and paused, and I watched my mother's spine straighten, watched her glance toward Denise with an expression that assumed the sentence was already finished in her favor. "I leave the entirety of my ownership stake in Hale Hardware, comprising all 5 store locations and associated business assets, along with the property at 14 Birchwood Lane, the lake cabin, to be held in her name outright, effective as of the date of execution of this document, for years prior to my death." The room went very quiet. My mother said, "Which daughter?" in a voice that already knew. Warren looked up. "The document specifies by full legal name," he said, and read it. "Mine." What came next was not, strictly, part of the will itself, but Warren had prepared for this. My father, it turned out, had specifically instructed him to have a second document ready for exactly this moment, a letter, along with copies of paperwork my mother had never known existed. Warren slid a folder across the table, the original manila one, my name misspelled on the tab in my father's cramped handwriting, Sarah with no H, the way he'd always written it on birthday cards without anyone ever correcting him, and inside it were 3 things. The first was a durable power of attorney for healthcare, executed 4 years earlier, on the same day as that appointment I'd driven him to without asking questions, naming me, not my mother, as his healthcare decision-maker in the event he was incapacitated and unable to communicate his wishes. It had never been formally invoked, my father having remained lucid enough, in his prior hospitalizations, to speak for himself. But it had existed, valid and enforceable, the entire 6 weeks I'd spent being turned away in a hospital lobby. It had existed the whole time my mother told a nurse I wasn't her daughter. Under Washington state law, and under the specific statute Warren had highlighted in yellow, apparently anticipating exactly this dispute, a validly executed healthcare POA supersedes a spouse's default authority the moment it's presented to a facility. Had the hospital known this document existed, had I known to bring it, the entire 6 weeks would have been legally, immediately, unambiguously different. The second was the ownership transfer for Hale Hardware itself, structured not as an inheritance, but as a living trust established 4 years earlier, meaning the business had, in a legal sense, already been mine, held in trust on my behalf long before my father's death, regardless of what happened to his will. My mother had spent 31 years married to a man whose primary asset had quietly stopped being his, or hers, for years before he died. Warren explained, for the benefit of everyone in the room, why my father had structured it this way rather than simply amending the will outright. A trust, unlike a will, isn't subject to probate delays or contest in the same way, and more importantly, it took effect immediately upon execution rather than waiting for death, meaning that even if my mother had somehow discovered the will's contents earlier and challenged them, the trust holding the business had already transferred, quietly, 4 years prior, and there would have been nothing left to contest by the time anyone thought to look. My father, it turned out, hadn't simply left me something in the end. He had spent 4 patient, deliberate years making sure that whatever happened in that hospital lobby, whatever my mother decided to say to a nurse on a Friday night, the outcome underneath it had already been settled and placed beyond her reach. I asked Warren, my voice not quite steady, why my father had chosen that specific date, 4 years earlier, to start all of this. He hesitated, the careful hesitation of a lawyer deciding how much of a confidence to share now that his client was gone, and then he told me. My father had come to him 4 years ago, not long after a minor cardiac scare he'd apparently never mentioned to any of us, and had said, almost verbatim according to Warren's notes from that first meeting, that he'd realized he might not have as much time as he assumed, and that he needed to make sure the right things were true on paper, in case I run out of time to say them out loud. Warren had asked him, at the time, whether he wanted to discuss any of it with his wife. My father had declined, firmly, and asked that the matter remain confidential until his death or incapacity, a request Warren, bound by both instruction and professional obligation, had honored for 4 years, through phone calls he couldn't return and a 6-week hospital dispute he had no legal way to intervene in from the outside. The third was the letter. Warren asked if I wanted him to read it aloud or read it privately. My mother said, sharply, that whatever it was concerned the family and should be read aloud, and for the only time that afternoon. I agreed with her, though for entirely different reasons. I asked Warren to read it. It wasn't long. My father was not a long letter kind of man. It said in essence that he had watched, for years, the quiet difference in how his wife treated his children, and had told himself for too long that keeping the peace was worth more than correcting it. It said that he loved all 3 of his children, and did not intend this document as a punishment to Denise or Tyler, who were provided for elsewhere in the will. It said that he had chosen me, specifically, not because I had asked for anything, not because I had ever once, in 26 years, made a claim on him or on the business, but for exactly that reason. Because I never had. Because he trusted the person who wanted nothing from him to be the one who'd take care of what he'd built. It said he was sorry it had taken him this long to say any of it directly, and sorrier still that he suspected, even as he signed the papers, that saying it directly while he was alive might cost more than either of us could afford at the time. The last line was the one that undid me, sitting in that conference room with my mother's eyes on me and Denise's hand frozen halfway to her mouth. If you're hearing this read aloud, it means I didn't find the right moment to tell you myself, and I'm sorry for that. But I want you to know I saw you. The whole time. I saw you. My mother did not cry. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to write this as a moment of collapse, and it wasn't, not from her. What happened instead was quieter, and in its way, more revealing. This isn't possible, she said. He would have told me. He apparently decided not to, Warren said, gently but without hedging. The documents are valid. They were properly witnessed and notarized 4 years ago. I drafted them myself, at his request, with explicit instructions that they not be discussed with any other family member until this reading. She barely came around, my mother said, and I understood, watching her say it, that this was the actual belief underneath everything, not a momentary cruelty in a hospital lobby, but a genuinely held, deeply defended story she had told herself for years to justify a preference she'd never examined. She lived 2 hours away. She missed birthdays. She wasn't here. I called every Sunday for 6 years, I said. It was the first thing I'd said since the letter was read, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. I came for every holiday I could. I wasn't absent, Mom. I was just quiet about being present, because quiet was the only version of me you ever had room for. That's not fair. No, I said, it isn't. None of the last 6 weeks were fair either. You told a hospital I wasn't your daughter. You said it in front of a nurse, in front of a waiting room, and then you spent 5 more weeks making sure I never got a chance to prove otherwise. And this whole time, I put my hand flat on the folder in front of me, on the misspelled tab, on my father's handwriting. He'd already made sure it wouldn't matter what you said. He just never got the chance to tell either of us that, before it was too late for it to help him. Denise spoke for the first time since the letter, her voice small. I didn't know any of this. Mom said you'd basically given up on the family years ago. That's what she told us. That's what she's been telling us the whole time. I looked at my mother, and for the first time in that entire conference room, she looked away first. Warren, to his credit, did not try to smooth the moment over. He let it sit, the way I imagined my father would have wanted it to sit, exposed to the air for once instead of managed and softened and folded quietly back into the family's habit of pretending things were fine. He simply said, when the silence had gone on long enough, the trust and the POA are matters of record now. I'd encourage everyone to take some time before we discuss logistics of the business transition. There's no need to resolve everything today. My mother stood up first, gathering her purse with hands that weren't quite steady despite her composure, and said, to the room in general rather than to me directly, I hope you're happy, which was, I think, the closest she was capable of coming to an admission that something in her account of the last 30 years had just been proven wrong in front of witnesses. Tyler, who had said almost nothing during the entire reading, spoke up as my mother reached the door. Mom, he said, did you know? About the letter, I mean. Not the trust, the part where he said he'd been watching how you treated her. His voice wasn't accusatory, exactly. It sounded more like a man doing arithmetic in real time, and not liking the answer he was getting. My mother turned around in the doorway. For just a moment, something in her face slipped, not the composed mask she'd worn through the reading, but something closer to what I imagined she must have looked like 30 years earlier, before 3 decades of managing a household's emotional weather had hardened into a permanent expression. I did what I thought was best for this family, she said. I have always done what I thought was best for this family. I believe that you believe that, I said, and I meant it, which surprised me even as I said it. I don't think you woke up one day and decided to be cruel to me. I think you decided, a long time ago, that I needed less than everyone else, and you've spent 30 years finding reasons that decision was correct instead of questioning whether it ever was. That's not the same as malice. But it cost exactly the same as malice would have, to the person on the other end of it. She didn't respond to that directly. She looked instead at Warren and asked, in a voice that had gone slightly brittle, what the timeline was for sorting out the business logistics, as if the entire emotional core of the last hour could be filed away as an administrative matter to be handled later, the same way she'd once filed away my absence from the family narrative as a footnote rather than a fact requiring explanation. Warren told her, evenly, that we could schedule a follow-up meeting whenever everyone was ready, and that there was no obligation to resolve anything that afternoon. She left without saying goodbye to me. Denise lingered a moment longer, and before she followed our mother out, she turned back and said, quietly, I'm sorry. I didn't know it was like this. I should have asked more questions a long time ago. I told her it wasn't her fault, and I mostly believed that, though I understood, watching her go, that repairing 30 years of a managed narrative wasn't going to happen in a hallway outside a conference room. It was going to take longer than that, if it happened at all. I wasn't happy. I want to say that clearly, because the version of this story that ends in triumph is a lie, even a comforting one. I was holding a folder that meant I'd never get back the 6 weeks I'd spent in a parking lot, never get back the last conversation I didn't know was the last conversation, never get to ask my father, out loud, why he chose silence for 4 years when a single sentence, spoken while he could still speak it, would have spared all of us this exact room. I had the deed. I did not have him. It's been 8 months now. I run Hale Hardware, all 5 stores, including the original one with my grandfather's name still faintly visible under the newer sign. I kept my father's photo of my community college graduation on the shelf behind the desk in store number 1, exactly where he'd left it, because it turns out grief doesn't require you to redecorate. My relationship with my mother did not repair itself in some tidy, cinematic way, and I want to be honest about that too, because I think stories like this one owe their audience the truth more than they owe them a bow on top. We speak occasionally. It's careful, formal, the way you'd speak with someone you're trying to remain civil with rather than someone you trust. I don't know if that changes. I've stopped assuming it has to, on any particular timeline, or at all. Some things, once said out loud in front of witnesses, don't fully go back into their boxes. Denise and I talk more now than we did in the 15 years before this happened, not because either of us is owed an apology from the other, but because the letter, and the reading, and the 6 weeks before it forced a kind of honesty into our family that had never existed there before. She told me, a few months later, that she'd spent years quietly resenting me for what she'd been told was my absence, and that unwinding that resentment, once she understood the actual shape of things, was its own strange grief. I believe her. I think my mother's careful management of what each of us was allowed to know about the others was, in its own way, one of the deepest costs of this entire story, not just what it did to me, but what it did to all three of us, kept slightly apart, slightly suspicious for the sake of a peace that was never actually peace, just silence with better manners. Tyler, of everyone, changed the most. He asked to spend a few weekends learning the actual operations side of store number 1, not because he wanted a job exactly, but because, he told me, he wanted to understand what our father had actually built instead of just growing up adjacent to it. We've started having a real relationship for the first time in either of our adult lives, one built on choice rather than obligation, and I find I like the brother I'm getting to know now considerably more than I ever expected to back when I assumed our distance was simply the shape of who we were. I hired an employment attorney early on, separately from the estate matters, to make sure I understood my rights regarding the hospital's handling of the visitation dispute, not because I intended to sue anyone, but because I wanted, for my own sake, a clear professional accounting of exactly what had gone wrong and whether it could happen to someone else. What I learned confirmed something I'd already suspected: hospitals, absent documentation, will almost always default to whichever family member presents as the more established authority, and adult children without an executed healthcare directive are more vulnerable to exactly this kind of exclusion than most people realize until they're the one standing in the lobby. I've since become, somewhat unexpectedly, the person in my friend group who tells everyone to go get a healthcare power of attorney drawn up in their 30s, not their 60s, regardless of how healthy or close-knit their family currently seems. You don't get to choose which year your family becomes a different family. You only get to choose whether you're prepared for it. There are still nights I wish I could ask my father the simplest, least legal question of all, not why he built the trust, not why he chose me, but why he never just told me, over one of those Sunday phone calls, while I could still hear it in his actual voice instead of Warren's careful, professional reading of it. I think I know the answer, or as close to an answer as I'll ever get. I think he was a man who'd spent 31 years avoiding the one conversation that mattered most, and by the time he understood how little time he had left to have it, silence had simply become the only language he was fluent in. I don't think that makes it right. I think it makes it human, in the same unfinished, imperfect way most of the people we love turn out to be human, right up until the day it's too late to tell them so. I think about my father's letter often, not the parts about the trust or the stores but the very last line. I saw you. The whole time. I've come to believe that's the only inheritance that actually mattered, and the paperwork was just the vehicle he found to make sure I finally heard it. He wasn't a man who could say things directly while he was alive. He found another way. I wish, more than I wish almost anything, that he hadn't needed to. If there's a lesson in this, and I've had 8 months to look for one, it isn't really about wills, or hospitals, or even about my mother. It's this: the people who see you clearly don't always say so out loud, and sometimes you don't find out you were seen until long after it would have been easier to hear it. Don't wait for a folder in a lawyer's office to tell someone what you actually think of them. Say it now, badly if you have to, imperfectly, while they can still hear it in your voice instead of read it in someone else's. If this story meant something to you today, I'd genuinely love to hear which part hit hardest, down in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, the kind about the receipts we keep and the people who finally get seen, make sure you're subscribed. Some of you needed this one more than you expected to.